The Chicago Bulls season surely hasn't all turned out the way that we had hoped and or expected it to, and currently sitting at the 11th seed with a 16-21 record, one seed behind the play-in. There's a lot of questions that are surrounding this Bulls team on what they should do for this year as well as for the future. And I think the biggest question surrounding that is what to do with DeMar DeRozan. And that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about in this video today. But if you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. But let's not waste any more of your time. Let's go and get right into the video. As mentioned, the Bulls currently sit at the 11th seed, one seed behind the 10th seed, about midway through the season. And there's a lot of questions, a lot of speculation going on about what the Bulls should do with DeMar DeRozan primarily. There are some other questions, of course, occurring on if Vooch should stay around. Some fans are even suggesting a move from Zach. I think that's the worst thing that they could do. But I think the biggest question has kind of been, what should the Bulls do with DeMar DeRozan? Should they hold on to him and, ride out the rest of his contract, ride out the rest of the season, see what's going on there? Should they attempt to move him? And what are you moving him for? That's exactly what I'm going to be covering in this video right here. So, with kind of a rough start to season, 16-21, slightly below 500, the Bulls are technically still in the race for the playoffs. But with the current look of the team, nearly halfway through the season, it may be time that we start to talk about potentially making a decision for not only this year, but also long-term success of the team. DeMar DeRozan is aging, and of course, when he was brought to the team, he was already an aging veteran at that point, and some people thought he was going to be on a downhill slide. But since joining the Bulls, I think he's been playing some of the best basketball he has of his entire career, for being honest. But nonetheless, he is still an aging player, and an aging player means at some point you're probably not going to get the production for the price. And that's kind of the biggest worry right now, because DeMar is still producing at a super high level. He's still all-star level. He's still playing great. But could you get more versatile and useful pieces this year and long-term for DeMar from some other teams? Now, DeMar DeRozan in the past 2 years has been playing like some of the best ball he has of his entire career, and for the most part has been the best player on the Bulls, being a first-team All-Pro last year. So, he's earned plenty of cheers from Bulls fans. Well-deserved cheers, that is. And this isn't a fun video to make, I would say. I'm a huge DeMar fan. I think he's brought a lot to this team. But you can't look at DeMar and just say that, oh, you have to keep him on the team, because there are potential other options. Now, although he has been great, he can do, there's only so much that he can do for this team at this current moment. Being an aging star with a primarily young roster surrounding him. DeMar DeRozan is 33 years old. Around this time is about when you start to see decline. Now, there are, of course, outliers. Obviously, LeBron, my apologies. Chris Paul has been pretty much an outlier. I mean, even DeMar DeRozan himself has kind of been an outlier. But for the most part, this is when you start to see players start to kind of take that downhill turn and worsen, if for no better way of saying so. They progressively get worse as you age, because your body's just not able to produce the same type of explosiveness, speed, all this that you were when you were younger. And the fact of being 33, DeMar is one of only 3 players on this Bulls roster that is over the age of 30. The other 2 being Goran Dragic, who was just brought to this team primarily just to be that guy that comes off the bench, and Nikola Vucevic, who I believe is like 31, maybe 32. Every single other player on this roster is below 30. Roster normally about 13 or so people, 12 people. That means you have, 9 or 10 people that are all below 30, and these are your only remaining guys. Now, of course, you do need veterans, but I don't think you need to be 30 and above to be a veteran, especially when you look at, the potential of what may happen, as time progresses on DeMar going down, versus having a veteran that's been in the league for 5 years or so, that's still like 28 and still can bring you, more of a long-term ability than potentially DeMar. I think DeMar, in this next year or so, could produce more than the players that you get for him but they're going to be able to produce for potentially 5 years for this Bulls team. So, maybe bring in some younger talent, maybe bring in some draft capital, and maybe who you get for Demar is enough to get you into the playoffs. I mean, the Bulls are right there, and depending on when Lonzo Ball comes back, that could be a huge contributing factor to this. So, the next topic here, question, what could the Bulls get in return for DeMar DeRozan? Now, DeMar is a piece that would likely be targeted by plenty of teams, but I think primarily playoff teams. Teams that are right there in a similar position to the Bulls. And by the way, I think the Bulls could be buyers at the deadline. I genuinely believe that. I think I could see them being buyers, keeping everyone together and just trying to get better. But I think if DeMar were to be moved, it would probably be to a playoff team, not only for what DeMar wants, but also because they're going to be willing to, take a little bit of risk. Maybe not to give up so much more, but they're willing to take a risk. I mean, people that aren't, on the edge of playoffs are not likely to give up a whole lot, because if they're not in the playoffs, they're probably a younger team. Why would you want an older vet for, a lot of picks? So, because of the fact that most teams that will want DeMar DeRozan are playoffs teams, it would, likely be unwilling to part with high-level players. You're not going to see DeMar go to the Lakers and then give up a pivotal piece. You're not going to see DeMar go to, a team and they give up their second or third best option. DeMar would likely become that second option. So you're not going to see a trade 1-for-1. You're going to see a trade for, draft capital potentially, a couple younger dudes that haven't quite figured it out yet, or things like that in return for that. I mean, look, perfect example, the Jimmy Butler trade. Jimmy Butler, now he wasn't an aging veteran at this point, but he was an all-star caliber player. He was, playing great basketball, and they ended up sending him to the Heat, who, thought they were going to be playoff contenders. Now, what happens, of course? To the Timberwolves. I don't know why I was jumping to the Heat all of a sudden. You send the Timberwolves, who thought they were going to be a playoff caliber team with, you had Karl Anthony Towns, you had some other pieces there, and what did the Bulls get back in return? They get some draft capital, which they use on Lauri Markkanen. You get a young guy who was dealing with some injury issues in Zach LaVine, and you get a guy that hadn't quite figured it out, but had potential in Chris Dunn. That is exactly kind of what I'm expecting from DeMar DeRozan. Now, I do think potentially DeMar DeRozan could get you a little bit more if someone's willing to take a risk, especially with how the market sits right now. But I think DeMar and, the Jimmy Butler trade a little while ago might be a little bit more similar than we would all anticipate. Now, for that reason, it's likely the Bulls would be looking at, as mentioned, a younger player, draft capital, but primarily someone that's dealing with injuries, someone that quite hasn't reached the full potential and hasn't figured it out yet, or someone that's just slightly younger and just a little bit worse. So, how would you target this? Well, picks would likely need to be added in either scenario, I do think. It's just a matter of what level of a pick. Because if you're getting a high-level pick, you're probably not going to get some great players. So one way to look at it right now is, let's talk picks first. Primarily picks. If you do picks, you're pretty much saying we're canceling the season. The season doesn't mean enough for us. We don't think we're going to make playoffs. And of course, with Lonzo Ball returning soon, who could be a pivotal piece and enough to get you over the hump, maybe you're not ready to throw in the book yet. But if you see Lonzo Ball is not going to be returning, maybe that injury is not figured itself out in the next month or so, which he was expected to return, multiple different times already, but somewhere between January and February. If it seems like he's not going to be returning soon, and you are not quite in the playoffs still at the deadline here, or even in the next coming weeks, maybe you look at DeMar, you look at this roster, and you're willing to move on DeMar for draft capital, because hopefully next year you'd get back Lonzo Ball. You have Zach LaVine, who you just re-signed, and you have some pieces around Zach and stuff that you believe in. Lonzo Ball, Zach LaVine, I think Caruso's still in the team. I believe Vooch's contract is up. That's a decision for the Bulls to make there. I would assume who's young and up and coming. Dalen Terry, you obviously picked him because you believed in him. If you want to keep Kobe White, there's young pieces that you can work around. And then if you got draft capital, you get Lonzo back. Maybe you're playing close to the, playoff level with Lonzo returning being enough, because I do think that this team, how it sits now without Lonzo or next year, will likely be in a range where they're in playoff competition. But if you do draft picks, maybe you can, take a little bit of risk on a guy here or there. Get back the draft pick that you still don't have from that Vooch trade with the Magic, I want to say. Maybe draft capital isn't the worst decision. But I think that more than likely for the Bulls, and what I would personally do is we're going to see a mix. We're going to see players involved, for example, like how the Jimmy Butler trade was, where you got a guy like Zach who has some injury-related issues, a guy that hasn't quite figured out, Chris Dunn, and a draft pick. I think that's more likely than a bunch of picks because, by trading DeMar, and especially depending on how you do it, you're kind of saying, oh, we're going to be entering a light rebuild, I would say. A lot of people refer to it as a retool, but I think if you move DeMar and you don't move somebody in his place, which they could technically do in free agency with Vooch contract lightening up, I think that's more of a rebuild than a retool. A retool, we're talking about like exchanging player for player, where a rebuild is like you kick this player out and then you bring in some new people. And I just don't know if the management, general management, coaches, even the players are willing to say, hey, we messed up by taking DeMar. We messed up in that Vooch trade. We're going to fix this right now and deal with it. I don't think they're willing to admit that. And for that reason, I'm not so sure if they're going to be willing to trade DeMar. Because if they trade DeMar, it's almost like saying, yeah, we were wrong. DeMar wasn't enough to get this team where we wanted them, so we're moving on from him. But of course, with players like, Zach LaVine, Lonzo Ball, Ayo Dosunmu, and potentially Vooch still on the roster, it's, not unlikely that the Bulls could re-enter the playoffs with or without DeMar DeRozan this year. I mean, there's plenty of possibility with or without DeMar, with or without Lonzo, that this team could still edge its way into the playoffs. I mean, they've been winning games, and tough games that we didn't see them win last year. I mean, they have a above record against the Celtics. I think they have above record against the Bucks. I think they just lost the past two to the Cavs back-to-back nights, but I think they beat the Cavs early in the year. They've beat top-level teams pretty consistently this year. They're losing against low-level teams. They're stooping to their level and losing those games, which is pretty much a complete opposite of last year. So I think if they can figure out that bottom half situation, they can become a playoff. Definitely be a playoff team. So, the question then arises, what should the Bulls do with DeMar, and what should they do, in total? And would it be worth it for the Bulls to move on from DeMar DeRozan? Now, I do think Lonzo Ball's injury plays a huge factor in this. A Lonzo return, that's probably enough to convince this team that, hey, it's worth keeping this together. Lonzo, Zach, DeMar, Vooch, I mean, that's an incredible top four levels of players. And depending on how you move things around, you still have Patrick Williams, who is a really, really good-looking young star, a young player who has potential to be close to a star. That's how I see Patrick Williams personally. I think a lot of this does depend on Lonzo Ball. So with DeMar becoming a free agency, once again, after this next season, his value will lower down. I think he's on contract until the 2024 offseason, is what I want to say. I may be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure. So the longer you wait on this, if you change your mind and you decide to do it in the offseason, not right now, his value is going to plummet because there's going to be less time on the contract, and you're just going to get less value for him. Also, of course, his age, along with the Bulls being a non-playoff team at this current moment, is going to bring down his value. You're not going to trade a bunch of players to a non-playoff team, not only because that could cause problems later down the road in the playoffs for the team trading, but also, a playoff team versus a non-playoff team is, you're a little bit more willing to take some bad contracts in a playoff scenario than a non-playoff scenario. And if you're not willing to take some poor contracts in a non-playoff scenario, you're probably also not likely to get, good level players, because you need a little bit of that give and take when you're doing a trade like that. But under the right circumstances, bringing in some young pieces, whether that's draft capital and trades, and if they mesh well with this young roster, we could end up seeing this Bulls team use draft capital, use these young players, and still be a playoff contender. Maybe not championship contender, but a playoff contender if things can just mesh right. There are potential opportunities where you bring in a player that works better with the team than Demar. Maybe they don't play better than Demar, but they work better with the team than Demar did, and the team ends up improving off this. Even though Demar would be the better player in the trade, there's potential for the team to get better by losing a better player. I mean, that does happen from time to time. Oh, excuse me. And I do think, competing is the most important factor. As I mentioned, I don't think the general management and the coaching are willing to say, hey, we messed up by taking Demar. I think the only way a trade like this does go through is if they're still playoff contenders either this year or next year. I think they're willing to, if it's not looking right and Lonzo Ball's not going to return, I think they're willing to be like, okay, we're not going to make playoffs this year. But there's no way they're making a trade to move out DeMar DeRozan with potential for Lonzo Ball to return next year without, knowing this is a playoff level roster. I think that's the only way that they move on from DeMar is if they can build another playoff roster immediately after. And after a long rebuild that we saw after moving out Jimmy Butler and all these pieces, bringing in Zach, about 4 years, 5 years, after such a long rebuild, I'm not quite sure they're willing to go back into something like that. Now, I wouldn't say it's a rebuild quite yet. Maybe a light rebuild, maybe a retooling, but I'm not quite sure they're going to be willing to go from rebuild to 1 year success and then go back into shifting this roster around a bunch. Now, truthfully, I don't really see the Bulls making this trade in general, but especially if they're not, on the edge of completely collapsing before trade deadline, before February. That's about one of the only scenarios where I see this happening, or if a perfect opportunity does arise, which, could potentially happen. People are willing to throw out really obscure and really poor trades at the trade deadline if they think that they're close enough. I think those are the only two scenarios where this trade does occur, is if the Bulls are just absolutely not going to make playoffs and Lonzo Ball is not returning, or it's just the perfect trade opportunity that does arise. So, the question, of course, for you guys would be, should the Bulls trade DeMar? And what should the Bulls get in return for DeMar? And do you see this team making playoffs this year if they trade DeMar and if they keep DeMar? So if you think, yes, the Bulls should trade DeMar, this is what they should get, will they make playoffs? Kind of that setup. But, like I said, honestly, I don't see this trade happening pretty much under any circumstances. There are two circumstances, as mentioned, where I think it could happen, but I just don't see the Bulls and the team as a whole willing to admit their mistake and try to fix it this early. And that's primarily why I think that this trade won't happen. But I do think it is good enough to look into. Now, of course, I do really, really enjoy DeMar DeRozan. I think he's brought a lot to this team. I think he's been one of the most clutch players in a long time in this league, and especially for the Bulls. And he's brought so much to this team. I do think he works well with Zach LaVine. I've heard some reports that him and Zach maybe aren't working so well behind the scenes. Whether that's true or not, or just media talk, I'm not quite sure. But I do really enjoy what DeMar brings. If it came down to who to keep, him or Zach, I'm keeping Zach LaVine 100% of the time. But, you do have to look at this trade and be like, all right, is it worth it? Personally, if I know Lonzo's not returning and you're out of the playoffs, you're at the 12th seed, or you're a couple games back at this point and you're not winning the games you should be, I might be willing to trade DeMar to a team like the Mavericks, to a team like, the Warriors, I think, would potentially be a team that he goes to. The Raptors, I wouldn't be surprised if the Raptors tried to make a trade, or the Lakers, because he's been linked to them. Those are four teams that I, under the right circumstances, could potentially trade DeMar DeRozan to. But as mentioned, what do you guys think about this? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It truly means the world to me. And as always, I hope it taught something today. Hope it made you smile. Hope it made you laugh. Something really important. It affects most day in a great way. And as always, you guys all be safe out there.